Welcome to the Continuous Delivery Podcast. My name is Zarar.
I'm Chezzy.
And I'm Gino.
Welcome to Chezzy and Gino, especially to Chezzy, who's making a appearance after a very long time. He's been busy baking bread. What are you up to, Chezzy? In 30 seconds before we get into it, give us a quick overview why you have been so absent from this podcast.
I've been incredibly busy. My wife and I started a couple of bakeries in downtown Toronto, and I'm still working with 2 clients as well. So my days are full with the clients. My evenings are full of the bakeries. So just very busy these days.
Yeah, and shout out to Chezzy. He's the one who introduced me to Elixir, which in my last podcast, we talked a little bit more deeply about. So maybe another podcast in the future dedicated entirely to Elixir.
Yep.
But for now, we have duties to attend to, and we're going to focus on a listener question. And this comes from Ejar Sheikh, who says he likes the podcast and so on, so on. He goes, I would like to request a session focused on Scrum anti-patterns that you have encountered firsthand, and talk a little bit about project managers who Cheesy's already rolling his eyes. Project managers who are maybe struggling to make a transition to Scrum Masters or something of that, of that space. I think we've sort of covered tangentially those 2 topics, but we haven't dedicated a whole episode to it. Right. So Scrum anti-patterns is where we're going to start. And I'll start with Gino to kick us off here.
I thought, first of all, that a project manager in a Scrum setting is an anti-pattern to start with.
Okay, why is that? Why is that? What do you think that?
Well, I mean, a couple of different reasons, right? It's not that project managers are not good people and they can do good work, but it's typically the classic way of doing project management is not aligned with the way that Scrum is supposed to work and the way that Scrum is delivering value, right? So, Scrum initially was intended to do product development, and it's still a product development framework. It's not a project management framework. It's very different. So it actually helps the teams to innovate and work in short iterations to get something done, to get value to the client and get feedback of that value, or get feedback of that product, and then improve this. And this is how you innovate on your product. And project managers, or at least classic project management, is focused on building schedules and adhering to those schedules and adhering to the budgets and so on that are associated with this. So it's not really a good match, right? But unfortunately, because of the popularity of Scrum, project managers have started using it as a project management framework, and that's where all these things go wrong.
Mm-hmm. So you're stepping back from the whole thing and looking at the structure of where Scrum is applied instead of diving into the anti-patterns per se. You're like saying your Scrum.
It's one of them, right? Yeah. It's one anti-pattern is that it's applied in the wrong place, right?
Okay, Chezzy, you want to add to that, or?
Well, I was going to take on a couple of the anti-patterns that I see that with people who are trying to use Scrum. I would say probably the largest anti-pattern that I see is teams bringing in work items or user stories that are too large. And so what you end up having is, at the beginning of a sprint, which I think a sprint is an anti-pattern, but we'll stop with that. But at the beginning of a sprint, you see a large number of work in progress. All of the developers pull these really large stories in that last half or 2/3 or so of the sprint, and kind of at the end, then there's this huge scramble to try to get everything code reviewed and merged, and then into a QA environment because that's how they view testing, and so and often many of the stories don't make it. And so they have to either carry them over, or heaven forbid, another anti-pattern is where they close that one and open a new one to finish it off, because we've got to keep our velocity numbers high. So that pattern in and of itself is a huge anti-pattern. I think the root cause of it is now this is going to be very controversial, but the whole notion of user stories, which I think is a problem. So, which let me get into that in detail a little bit later. But
we'll get into it now. I mean, so
maybe now's the time. I think user stories themselves are an anti-pattern, and they didn't necessarily come from Scrum. They first came out in XP, right? So that's where extreme programming. Shout out to Ron Jeffries. He invented them and says that he hates them now, or something like. Maybe I could be wrong, but I think we have built this notion around a user story as something that adds quote unquote value from a product owner's perspective. We've got the whole INVEST acronym. Testable is one of those. But whenever we talk about testable in that context, we think about testable by a QA person, which means, and we've all heard that it has to be end to end. And that's why we end up with user stories that take, 6-7 days to complete, as opposed to I no longer teach user stories. I'm okay if we have little tasks that are not end to end, as long as it's something that can be finished in like a few hours or a day, then I find that everything is simpler. If you do code reviews, which my teams don't most of the time, if you do code reviews, they're smaller. If you have to merge, there's much less likelihood of a merge conflict. The testing, we run with the motto that once you merge the code, it has to be production ready. So the testing doesn't happen afterwards. So I find that slicing things down, breaking things down further helps maybe alleviate that whole anti-pattern that we see in Scrum.
Yeah, I mean, user stories. So going to riff off that a couple things and add one anti-pattern for myself. I think user stories. I think those days are sort of over, frankly, just because I think the architecture of modern applications is quite complex. It's gotten increasingly complex over the years, where it's no longer just a monolith. You may have to make a change to a batch job, a UI, a mobile app, a service, some sort of scheduler. So for you to deliver an end-to-end feature, there's just naturally a lot of changes you need to make to a lot of different places. So the end-to-end concept doesn't really work anymore. It worked well, I think, in the 2000s when you mostly had server-side applications rendering like one page, maybe a database. But now with distributed architectures and microservices and whatnot, it's gotten more. I'm not saying it's not possible. It's just very difficult. So I think one anti-pattern I see is to try to bundle up your entire story into it, and making it too big, as Chezzy said. Another one I will add is that
let me jump into that one first a little bit, because I kind of disagree with all of this, specifically related to the user story part. I think what you're referring to are features, which is very different, and those are indeed end-to-end concepts, and they are all big, and they typically take longer for sure. The user stories are the tasks that Chezzy is referring to. In my opinion, whether you call it user stories or something else, it's not. I don't really care. But it's something that you need to be able to verify whether or not it does what it's supposed to do. You need to be able to get feedback from it. And sometimes changing something small in a batch job, you can actually verify whether or not this does what you expect it to do, right? And you can get feedback on it and improve on it if you want to. For me, whether you call this a user story or a task, I don't really care. But for me, it's really all about, can you actually get some feedback about the stuff that you're building and that you complete? And that thing needs to be as small as possible.
So I think the feedback is where you and I might disagree, a little bit. Sure. Because for me, unit test is feedback. So, sure. I don't need to have something that a product owner can go out and say, oh, yeah, this is right for me, because sometimes in order to get to that, I want the product owner to say it's right before I open a feature toggle and release it, Right. But
I see.
Sometimes in order to have something that the product owner can go out and give, they can get that feedback, it tends to be larger. So for me, as long as I can get feedback from a set of unit tests, as long as I've got, that kind of feedback that it's working, let's merge it. Let's push it.
Oh, no, I agree with that, Chezzy. I don't think we say something different.
Okay, good.
Yep.
Well, you mentioned a couple times there that you don't care if it's a user story or a task. Well, I think I sort of do care because I think there's an association with user stories built over time that they have to deliver an end-to-end user functionality which can be tested and so on. I think when we change the verbiage to simply some piece of work that can be verified, that's what I'm referring to. I think you and I are saying the same thing. I think I differentiate between a task and a user story, where you see them very interchangeable. I still see user stories as something bigger.
I wouldn't necessarily say that, but I see tasks as other pieces as well, things that are not necessarily verifiable, are just things that need to happen, right? And don't necessarily improve your product, but it's just something that needs to happen along the way. Anyways, but I think that we've established that we can really align on the concept here, and that is that these things that we are doing and that we're tracking need to be small and verifiable in some way, whether it's through unit testing or it's something that is visible from the outside.
Yeah,
not necessarily by the product owner.
Let me add the anti-pattern that I was going to specify, and I think this is my pet peeve. I think I mentioned this before in podcast, but two things I want to say. One is this idea that now that we are doing Scrum, we need to have X amount of stories ready for the next X sprints. That to me is like my favorite pet peeve. We've talked about why that's a bad idea. One, you may as well not be doing Scrum if that's what you're going to be doing. If you're gonna use Scrum as a tool to manage a schedule, then just say you're doing that, and don't say you're doing Scrum. Just say I'm using sprints to manage a schedule. You're not doing Scrum. You're using sprints as a tool. That's it. Yes. So I think just to be aware of what you are doing is very important, because if you are really doing Scrum, at the end of every iteration, you are genuinely asking the question, did we implement the right thing? Did we do this right? Not, okay, we did that. What's the next batch of work that we need to do? You sort of defer your decisions on what you are building as late as possible, instead of defining over the next 4 sprints, we have this many stories, let's churn away at them. And I've encountered this too many times. And when I try to make the point that, well, that's a surefire way of killing innovation, because you've already made all your decisions. You already made all your product decisions, and you've already made a little box.
It's not product, it's project managers. You've made your project decision.
Correct. And it's exactly the comment that I was making at the beginning, right? Yes, what you're referring to right now.
I want to build on that just a little bit, Zarar, and add just one thing to it. The anti-pattern, I think this is what you're saying, or maybe not, but where we use Scrum to run a waterfall, and we don't release until, sprint 14 or something like that, at their deploy code. So again, that is not what Scrum is about. You're not at a minimum deploying your code at the end of a sprint. Then you need to ask yourself why.
Yeah, I have a couple of other anti-patterns that follow that. I've seen with a client a team that had struggles to actually deliver something meaningful by the end of their sprint. So, and that was because they were not set up well, and testing was behind, and was another team, and they needed to throw it over the wall, and all of these. I mean, I'm calling out like 5 anti-patterns right there, right?
Yeah.
So
everyone says an anti-pattern.
We'll get into those as well. But what actually happened there is, instead of looking at how can we change the way we work so we can get something done within that sprint, they said, well, we are going to reassess our process to be, we're only going to make sure that our code compiles. That's it. And that was the extent of their sprint. And then it would be thrown over the wall, and somebody else would do the testing. I'm like, wow, forget it. I mean, you're not doing Scrum. There's no point in doing this right now. What you're actually doing is you're moving the problem elsewhere, and you're completely making the problems invisible again to the outside world. So that's kind of one. I'm sure you have some comments on that as well before I dive into the next one.
Well, just to throw it over the wall, the anti-pattern that there is that, Scrum needs to be a whole team, so if you have somebody else who's doing the quote unquote testing, or another group that's writing the quote unquote automation, then you're not doing Scrum.
Yeah. And what I've seen as well as another response to the same problem, and that they couldn't get things done, is they just make the sprint length variable. Like, oh, we're not done yet. Let's add another week. And like, well, what's the point? There's a reason why these sprint lengths are the same size. It's so that you have some kind of sense of what you can get done and what cadence you can work with. And also that you're building in a cadence to get that feedback and getting something to the client or to a releasable state. You're getting rid of all of that right now just because you have taken on too much work instead of looking at how can we take on less work or how can we define our work differently, right? So it's those kinds of things that are kind of coming are two different answers to the same problem, two ways of not solving it.
Yeah, absolutely. Can I throw out another anti-pattern here, guys?
You go for it, then I got one too.
Okay. So an anti-pattern that I have seen, and this often comes whenever you have management who wants to micromanage or you have project managers who want to control it, is trying to push teams on the metrics. And let's face it, in Scrum, velocity is king, unfortunately, and so I think using velocity to try to say if a team is doing well is an anti-pattern, and comparing velocity across teams is obviously an anti-pattern, or setting goals for velocity is just a huge problem. And you're going to see a lot of negative results come out of that.
Explain why, Chezzy. I fully agree, but maybe give the audience some why on why that's a bad idea. Because I'm just going to play devil's advocate, which is like, hey, why don't we keep track of the team and see if they're doing well or not, and support them if the velocity dips? Because that's the one argument that I hear from management is that we got to monitor the teams in case they need help.
So velocity is not a measurement of anything except for a measurement of a guess. That's all it is. How well did I guess at something? So if you want to measure a team, then move more toward the lean metrics like cycle time, throughput, et cetera, right? Because those are a measurement of what is. But whenever we talk about velocity, it is not a measure of anything that's real. It's a measurement of a guess that we take. And often, unfortunately, we're forced to make that guess whenever we know very little about what it is we actually have to do. And so, to be quite honest, I think it's a metric that provides zero value. I never use it. I encourage teams to not use it. And instead, it's very, very easy just to simply start to look at things like average cycle time or look at daily throughput, and there you go. Those are things that a team could use as a experiment, as we make a change to say, did this change have a positive impact or not? Velocity won't give you that info because it can be gamed just too easy.
Yeah, mine was kind of related, kind of stole my thunder there, but I think there's one point that I do want to say. In just estimates in general, I think whenever estimates are being used to project out a schedule, that's an anti-pattern. I think estimates are great to discover what different people think about a particular problem, and that's the whole idea behind story poker or planning poker. Which is, hey, you think of something different than what I think of the story, and let's have a conversation about it. And that's why we point. Yeah. When those points are taken to draw out a schedule, that's an anti-pattern. And a project manager listening to this might be, hey, okay, so what do I do? Like, what tooling are you're pointing out all these problems? What are you trying? Can you help me schedule things or do better? Now, if you are working in a sort of a a good product mindset, you're obviously thinking, what's the next thing I can do over the next 2 weeks and ship over? But if you're not in that environment and you're forced to come up with a schedule, I would highly look at Monte Carlo analysis, Monte Carlo statistical analysis to project out schedules. Maybe we can have a whole episode dedicated to how to do that and so on in the future. But as a tip, just look into that instead of projecting, instead of just doing estimating to schedules. And one thing, before I go to you is, Chezzy, you both touched on it, but I want to be explicit about it. If you are not deploying your code to production at the end of the sprint, you are not doing Scrum. Forget about this caveat that I hated how the Scrum guide put potentially shippable software. I wish they had just gotten rid of the word potentially there, because people have taken that one word and used it as an excuse to do nothing. So let me deploy your code to production, and if you can't do it, ask the question why you can't do it and solve that problem.
And I'll throw out a caveat. Deploy to production doesn't necessarily mean release to your users.
Yes,
correct.
If you've listened to our episodes before, you know that we've talked a lot about separating deployment from release. There might be reasons why you don't want to release, but deploying takes care of so many problems and minimizes likelihood of defects substantially.
Yeah. So. Yeah, and you said there are at the end of the sprint, at the very minimum, at the end of the sprint. Minimum, I would add to that. Now, I just wanted to add one caveat related to the estimation conversation. I agree, 100% agree with you, as there are. Sometimes, however, teams who are not mature at doing this might need some kind of estimation in the beginning to feel comfortable. But that hopefully is a transitionary period, and they can get over that very quickly. So I just wanted to call that out. So one of the things that was mentioned here as well was the assign, or not even mentioned yet, I think, is the assigning work to individuals on the team, right? Also from a project management, oftentimes perspective, or at least coming out of that kind of mindset where there's one person, whoever that might be, who is actually assigning work randomly, or in their mind probably not randomly, to individuals to actually get that done. So all of those benefits from working together and trying to figure it out together and innovating are completely thrown out of the window. So that as well is something that doesn't make an awful lot of sense. At the same time, you're not working through whatever is on your backlog in the most effective way, because as you are assigning things to someone, you are creating individual queues and not just a queue for the entire team, right? Mm-hmm. So there's this yet another anti-pattern that you see an awful lot that I think is worth mentioning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Great point, Gino. Totally. Because we sometimes, and I think the question also asked about how project managers, one of the things they struggle with is I think they struggle to go from a push to a pull mechanism. Scrum is still a pull-oriented framework. The team is still deciding what to pull into the sprint. And if you have one particular person deciding who works on what, well, your autonomy is going out the window. You're basically becoming the single point of failure in the system because you're making the decisions on who gets to work on what, and you take away the team creativity out of the equation. It's on you as a PM to decide, and I think that's definitely another anti-pattern. Chezzy, you gotta.
Furthermore, that assignment tends to drive collaboration away. So whenever you try to teach folks to pair, to mob, to work with each other, to collaborate together, if you've got that story that's assigned to you, unfortunately, it seems that people are less likely to let go of their story and go and help. So
I'll throw in one which I think I see a lot is having sort of stale retrospectives or using the sort of the same retrospective pattern every single time. I think as a Scrum Master or a project man or whatever you are, I think keeping retrospectives fresh and really spending some time before the retrospective to create a plan for the retrospective is important. If you walk into the retrospective like 5 minutes late, same old, nobody's talking, huge anti-pattern. Again, the core of Agile to me has always been continuous improvement, and retrospectives are your chief mechanism on how to do that. So if your retrospectives are getting stale, you should ask yourself, what am I doing wrong? How can I make these a little bit better?
I would call out a family of anti-patterns or generalize this particular anti-pattern to going through the motions of Scrum. And that is retrospective. Well, it's scheduled, so we have to do it. Planning, it's scheduled, so we have to do it. Stand up, it's scheduled, so we have to do it, without really realizing what is intended with those particular events. And if you're actually looking a little bit deeper into those events, and as you said, retrospective, rightfully so, is all there to improve how we work, to figure out, okay, hang on, what worked well? How can we do something better next time? Because if we're doing this regularly, then we're getting better over time. And that's exactly all the continuous improvement. Planning as well is to try to figure out, okay, hang on, how are we going to tackle this thing? Do we get alignment around what we're trying to achieve together as a team, and what kind of difficult discussion that we might need to have a little bit up front, or a little bit up front being at the beginning of the sprint as opposed to figuring it out in the end. And the same thing with a stand-up. There is some value to that as well. And it is really about, well, okay, what am I going to work on, or is something that I'm blocked with that somebody else can help me on? If you're not recognizing what these the intent is of those particular events, and you're just going through the motion and have the events because they happen to be there without realizing that, well, then that's a big anti-pattern. And what you called out, Zarar, is just an example of that.
So I'll just build on that before I throw it to Chezzy, is that the daily stand-up, I think every team does that. 2 small anti-patterns, or 2 big anti-patterns. One is that your daily stand-up becomes a status update when it really should be a plan for the day. What's our plan for the day as a team? That's very different than, this is my status update from yesterday. So that's one that you can take away. And then one more is that, and this just boils my blood, is when team members wait till the next day's daily stand-up to communicate with their team members. They think that the stand-up is where you get to communicate with your team. That's a huge anti-pattern, massive red flag. The communication should be happening throughout the day, in real time, simultaneously, as needed, not at the daily stand-up. And unfortunately, I see too often that something happens at 2 p.m. the day before, and the other person who needs to know about it knows it at 9 a.m. the next morning at the stand-up. So that's another one you can take away. And easy ones to fix, really, from a Scrum Master perspective. So, Chezzy?
Yeah, so a little while ago, Zarar mentioned retrospective, and Gino built on top of that a little bit as well. But it bears to mention that at the core of Scrum is this notion of inspect and adapt, right? It's this notion of periodically, via retrospective, if you will, taking a look and see how we're working and making some changes and measuring how those changes happen. So I think a huge anti-pattern is the fear to move away from Scrum. And what I mean by that is Scrum brings a lot of good things. We've mentioned some of them here. We've referred to them. But if after a year, you're still doing Scrum by the book, you have not inspected and adapted, most likely. So don't be afraid to try new things that aren't a part of Scrum. We talked about lean metrics, et cetera. There's a lot of great ideas and notions out there in the DevOps world, in the XP world, in the lean world, et cetera. So I think the fundamental smell that I would throw out there is that you don't have to play Scrum by the book. Probably a good place to start, maybe, but over time, don't be afraid to experiment and change.
And I think with that, we will wrap this up. So, Chezzy, thank you. Gino, thank you for coming on. And Ejaz Sheikh, thank you for asking the question. Hopefully, you got something out of this discussion. Listener, follow us on LinkedIn, on Apple, Spotify, podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts. We're there. And we also have a YouTube channel, which we're posting this stuff on. So it's a continuous delivery podcast. Just search for it. You'll see it. Thank you for tuning in, and we will see you again soon enough.